At 3 o'clock in the morning, a woman on the edge of ending it all made one impossible call, not to 911, not to a friend. She called the alleged private number of Marilyn Monroe. This desperate act became the most profound connection of her life. The rain had been falling outside Esther's window for 3 hours, matching the frantic, quiet beating of her heart. In the deep silence of 3 o'clock in the morning, only one object mattered, the telephone receiver, cold and heavy in her trembling hand. It was the last desperate lifeline to a world that had forgotten she existed. Esther was 35 years old, and lately she felt less like a person and more like an echo. She was a woman who worked in a tiny office cubicle, lived in a small apartment where the worn floral rug was the only splash of color, and felt as if she were a supporting player in a grand, beautiful drama where her name was never listed in the credits. She had reached a terrible, quiet place where the only logical answer, the only way to end the relentless, quiet pain, was to end her existence entirely. She had been sitting there for 2 hours, watching the slow, inexorable march of time on the alarm clock, gathering the courage for this final, desperate move. But first, one improbable, theatrical gesture, a phone call. She hadn't called a crisis line or a friend for fear of being dismissed or failing to be understood. Instead, she had found a scrap of paper she had safeguarded for 3 years, a note given to her by an aging woman in a Hollywood memorabilia shop. Scrawled across the paper in shaky ink was a 7-digit number, allegedly the unlisted private telephone number of Marilyn Monroe. The idea was absurd, fantastical, and utterly hopeless. Exactly the kind of last-minute, impossible fantasy a weary mind clings to before finally letting go. Why Marilyn? Because Esther felt that if anyone understood the profound agony of being seen by millions yet known by no one, it was the woman behind the legend. She chose Marilyn, not the star, but the ghost. Because she believed that if anyone understood the agony of being seen by millions yet known by no one, it was the woman on the other end. She dialed the number slowly, methodically, treating each digit like a fragile relic. She had no expectation that it would connect, the phone would ring endlessly, or a machine would pick up, confirming that the wall between her world and the star's world was impenetrable. This failure would be the final piece of confirmation she needed, that the universe was silent, and her decision to close this chapter was the correct one. The silence between the digits was deafening, amplified by the relentless drumming of the rain against the glass. The feeling of invisibility was so heavy it felt like lead in her chest. She expected a busy signal. She expected the cold indifference of a disconnect. The phone started to ring, a simple, insistent chirp in the vast quiet of the apartment. It rang once, the sound piercing the fog of her despair. She raised her hand to slam the receiver back into its cradle, to retreat into the comforting silence of her final decision, ready to abandon the fight and all its pain. But before the third ring could finish, before Esther's hand could make contact, the ringing stopped. The unlisted line clicked, and a slow, breathy sound came over the line. Someone had answered. It was not a secretary, not a hired butler, and not a recording. It was a person, awake in the darkness, waiting for her to speak. Esther was frozen, listening to the soft, rhythmic sound of breathing coming from a place worlds away. The breathing stopped. A voice, familiar yet startlingly intimate, spoke into the void. It was soft, slightly drowsy, and utterly real. "Hello," it whispered. Esther's heart seized, not from fear, but from the impossible shock of the voice on the other end. It was the voice of Velvet, the voice of the world's most famous star, and it was waiting for her next word. The sound was a collision. A celestial body had just unexpectedly collided with Esther's small, insignificant world. Every person in the world knew that voice, the slight, breathy lilt, the hint of Hollywood glamour and private vulnerability woven into every syllable. It was the voice of Marilyn Monroe, calling out into the darkness from her unlisted life. Esther had not called an icon. She had called a ghost, and the ghost had answered. The sheer impossibility of the moment shattered Esther's despair. She was paralyzed, clinging to the phone in her small, rain-soaked apartment, utterly unable to speak. The woman on the other end, lying awake in her sprawling, silent mansion in Beverly Hills, was the most photographed, most talked about person on the planet. A celestial body that had just unexpectedly collided with Esther's small, insignificant world. Marilyn spoke again, this time with less questioning and more gentle acknowledgement of the intrusion. "It's very late, darling," she said. Her voice was slightly husky, suggesting she had perhaps been woken from a fitful sleep, or perhaps hadn't been asleep at all. The weariness in her tone was real and raw, stripping away the public persona and exposing the restless human core beneath. Esther suddenly realized she wasn't speaking to a myth, but to another insomniac, another woman awake alone in the 3 o'clock emptiness. That realization, that a famous woman might also feel the profound, hollow ache of the lonely hours, was enough to break Esther's composure. A quiet, muffled sound escaped her throat, a breath catching in a half-sob. It was an unspoken plea, a surrender to the despair she had been fighting for months. Esther fully expected the line to go cold. She expected the abrupt click of a celebrity having no time for the quiet grief of a stranger. But Marilyn Monroe. Miss Monroe did not hang up. She waited. She knew it was not a fan. It was a sound she recognized. The chilling sound of a final, desperate gesture. In the profound silence that stretched between the tiny San Diego apartment and the star's California bedroom, Marilyn listened. She listened to the weeping sound that was not a word, but a soul's desperate farewell, and she let the silence hold. That act of simple, sustained presence, a superstar granting 10 seconds of her unlisted time to an unknown woman's sorrow, was the most profoundly human gesture Esther had ever experienced. The initial drowsiness left Marilyn's voice entirely. When she finally spoke again, the tone was clear, sober, and stripped of every bit of Monroe affectation. It was the tone of a sister, a friend, someone who had heard this desperate sound before and instantly recognized its chilling gravity. She didn't ask, "Who is this?" or "What do you want?" Her priority was not her privacy or her time, but the desperate vulnerability of the person on the other end of the line. She was a celebrity who, in the middle of the night, chose to be an anchor. She drew a slow breath, and her voice, now steady, cut through the darkness, moving from sleepy whisper to clear, focused concern. Marilyn asked only one thing, a question that was simple, powerful, and utterly disarming, demanding a name, demanding existence, demanding Esther recognize her own value in the present moment. The question was gentle but firm. "Who is this, darling? You must tell me your name." It was a command disguised as a kindness, forcing Esther to reclaim her identity in the very moment she had chosen to shed it. In that whisper, Marilyn Monroe offered the first vital exchange in what would become a secret, lifelong covenant. Esther could barely manage the sound. The sobs had choked her throat, and the word she finally managed was small, plain, and utterly unglamorous. Esther. It was a name made for filing cabinets and commuter trains, a name that felt built for invisibility. She waited for a moment of confusion, perhaps a polite request to spell it, but the star did none of those things. Marilyn repeated the name, slowly, allowing it to hang in the air, giving it weight and dignity. "Esther," she murmured, "that is a beautiful name, a solid name." In repeating it, Marilyn did more than just acknowledge the call. She acknowledged the caller. She saw past the desperate hour and the unlisted number and saw a human being in crisis. The shift was immediate and profound. Marilyn spoke again, her voice softening further. "You must forget who you think you are speaking to, Esther. Forget the posters. Forget the soundstage. Right now, I am only a woman named Marilyn, and I am awake, and you have called me." It was an invitation to intimacy, a forceful act of de-escalation that tore down the immense glittering wall of fame between them. Marilyn's intuition was instant and terrifyingly accurate. She recognized the chilling sound of a final, desperate gesture. She pictured Esther in her mind, not a stalker or a demanding fan, but someone hanging by the thinnest thread. She knew she had to take charge to make the impossible connection real. In her own lonely palace, surrounded by silk and quiet, Marilyn sat up in bed, grounding herself in the quiet reality of the life she was holding on to across the telephone wires. "Esther," she said, her voice completely stripped of glamour now, becoming only the sound of concern. "You must believe me when I say I understand what the darkness feels like. But you called this line, and you spoke your name. That means the part of you that wants to live, the part that is still fighting, is stronger than the fear that brought you to the phone." The contrast between the two women was staggering. One, the global siren, trapped by her own dazzling visibility, constantly surrounded by people who loved the idea of her. The other, an invisible woman, crushed by her own anonymity, surrounded by a silence that made her grief feel absolute. Yet, in that telephone wire, they found a bizarre shared geography of pain. "I know you did not call just to say hello, Esther," Marilyn continued, her voice pressing gently. "And I know that what you are facing is real. I will not dismiss it. But I need you to tell me what has brought you to the phone. You called the star for a reason, but the woman is listening now. You called because you needed someone to notice you were standing on the edge. Now, tell me the truth." The pressure was immense, yet it was the gentle, relentless push of a perfect lifeline, forcing Esther to take the first, terrifying step back toward the light. Esther realized she had not been waiting for a voice of fame, but a voice of validation, and finally, she opened her mouth to tell the painful, honest truth of why she felt the world needed her no longer. The silence finally broke, not with a rush of words, but with a confession far more painful than any explanation of circumstance. Esther didn't tell Marilyn about lost jobs or lost love. She told her about the exhausting labor of being perpetually unseen. It was the moment the hidden woman confessed her greatest fear to the woman who was always hidden behind the spotlight. Esther's voice was small, dry, and honest. She spoke of her 35 years feeling like she had been waiting backstage for a cue that would never come. She described the terrible, creeping certainty that her life was merely atmospheric noise, a small, necessary quiet before the main event that involved other, more essential people. She said she felt like a supporting player, always handing the prop or holding the coat, never the lead. "If I were to step away," she whispered into the phone, "the world would simply close the space behind me and no one would even feel the draft. I wouldn't leave a hole." Across the immense wire, Marilyn Monroe remained absolutely silent. The power of her listening was the most arresting force Esther had ever encountered. There was no interruption, no hurried attempt to fill the void with cliché advice, no breath of impatience. Marilyn simply gave Esther the space of time and complete attention to spill out every forgotten fear and every ignored sorrow. She let the raw truth of anonymity hang there, validating the weight of Esther's pain with the profound gift of silence. Esther, who had spent her entire life being mentally dismissed by everyone around her, was now receiving the undivided, concentrated attention of the most famous woman in the world. Then Esther explained the reason for the 3 o'clock call. She admitted that she had spent years collecting photographs of Marilyn, not the glamorous pin-up shots, but the candid ones, the moments taken off guard late at night or waiting alone on a deserted set. In those unpolished frames, she saw not the bombshell, but Norma Jean. She saw the eyes of a woman who was fiercely loved and yet profoundly, existentially lonely, a woman who seemed to be pleading for a single, honest gaze. "I called now," Esther confessed, her voice thick with emotion, "because I thought that maybe in your own 3 o'clock darkness, you might understand what it is like to feel so terribly alone that you crave the relief of simply not existing anymore. I thought maybe in this deepest part of the night, the star might finally be just a woman who also knows what it means to be desperate for someone to simply notice that she is still breathing." Esther finished her confession, her voice a hollow whisper, her body aching with the effort of having finally spoken the unspeakable. She braced for the polite denial, the inevitable confusion, but across the silent wire, a soft, deliberate breath of deep recognition came, a quiet intake of air that was more powerful than any loud declaration. Then Marilyn Monroe uttered 2 profound, shattering words that instantly confirmed the terrifying, shared private truth of her own celebrated existence. Marilyn Monroe's 2 words, "I know," hung in the darkness like a verdict. They were an absolute confirmation that the star was not only listening, but that she understood the terror of anonymity better than anyone. It was the moment the public illusion dissolved, and 2 frightened women finally found refuge in a shared, private sorrow. Marilyn's voice was quiet, steady, and achingly honest. She admitted to Esther that the fear of being erased, of having the world look right through her, was the one constant companion that fame had failed to banish. She said she was terrified that one day the cameras would stop clicking, the crowds would disperse, and the fragile, anxious girl named Norma Jean would be left alone, just as invisible as she had been in her earliest years. She shared a single brief memory, a fleeting moment from her 20s standing on a large, bustling studio lot. She was already famous, already the image that would define a generation. Yet she had been ignored by a crew member who didn't recognize her without her full makeup and dazzling costume. It was only a moment, Marilyn whispered, but in that tiny space of time, I felt the whole world go quiet. I felt myself simply cease to exist. I was Miss Monroe, but at that moment, I was nobody. And I promised myself I would build walls so high and bright that no one could ever ignore me again. Fame had failed to banish the fear of being erased. The world adored the icon, but refused to see the fragile, anxious Norma Jean. She was seen by everyone, yet known by no one. She explained that the famous breathless siren, the Marilyn that the world loved, was a magnificent, gilded suit of armor, built to keep that childhood fear of invisibility locked away. The adoration of millions was the fuel that kept the armor polished and functional. But, she confessed, the terrible irony of that armor was that it also trapped the real woman inside. The world loved the icon, but they refused to see the anxious, intelligent, fragile Norma Jean. She was seen by everyone, yet known by no one. A profound loneliness that, in its own way, was just as terrifying as Esther's. The realization settled over Esther like a warm blanket. She and Marilyn were standing on opposite shores of the same terrible ocean of despair. Esther was sinking because she was forgotten. Marilyn was drowning because she was so aggressively remembered, but only for the false parts. Their wounds, though inflicted by different pressures, were identical. The desperate yearning to be seen truthfully. The bond forged between them in the darkness was not between a star and a fan, but between two souls recognizing a shared, crippling shadow. Marilyn gave Esther the profound gift of knowing that her pain was real and that it was shared even by the seemingly most fortunate woman in the world. She had validated Esther's suffering by holding up her own. Having fully acknowledged the depth of the shadow, Marilyn allowed a powerful new energy to enter her voice. She had matched Esther's raw truth with her own. Now she moved beyond the shared darkness, ready to project a fierce, protective light. Her voice regained its strength, no longer mirroring Esther's pain, but projecting a truth that would change everything, ready to deliver the powerful, life-altering answer Esther had subconsciously called for. The phone line crackled with a new tension, shifting from the weight of shared sorrow to the fierce intensity of absolute conviction. This was the moment of truth, the point where the entire impossible phone call found its profound, life-altering purpose. Marilyn Monroe, the woman who had spent a lifetime seeking to be loved, was about to deliver the words that would finally save a stranger. Marilyn took a long, slow breath on the line, the sound husky and deliberate, a dramatic drum roll preceding the statement of a lifetime. Her voice dropped to an intimate whisper as if she were revealing the most vital secret of human existence, a truth concealed behind all the lights and the glamour. She spoke directly to Esther's crippling feeling of being a supporting player, utterly replaceable in the vast drama of the world. "Esther," Marilyn said, her tone utterly firm, "you feel lost because you are looking for your worth in the wrong place. You are looking for a massive, universal whole to appear if you were to cease breathing. But the world doesn't work that way. The world is made up of millions of small, necessary lights, not one blinding sun." She paused, ensuring every syllable landed with undeniable force. "The greatest tragedy, my darling, is not feeling small. The greatest tragedy is not knowing that the light you carry is the only light that matters to those who haven't found theirs yet. You are not background noise, Esther. You are the specific, necessary, flickering lamp that someone somewhere will be stumbling in the dark looking for." The words struck Esther not as an abstract philosophical truth, but as a physical force. It was as if a heavy, binding shadow had been violently torn from her shoulders. Her hands gripped the receiver so tightly her knuckles turned white and a sharp intake of breath escaped her, the instant reversal of the despair that had almost taken her away. For the first time in years, she didn't feel like a superfluous shadow. She felt necessary. She felt irreplaceable. She felt impossibly seen in a way that the famous woman on the other end, for all her adoration, rarely was. Marilyn, hearing that desperate, life-affirming gasp, knew the battle had been won, but she didn't stop there. She insisted Esther internalize the truth, forcing her to claim the words herself. "Say it, Esther," Marilyn commanded gently. "Say, 'My light is necessary.'" Esther, tears streaming silently down her face, repeated the sentence back, her voice shaking but suddenly carrying a new, fragile weight. The despair was replaced by a small, fierce spark of self-worth. The air was lighter now, the relentless rain outside having softened to a gentle patter, as if the universe itself was settling down after the storm. Esther had received the gift of seeing herself through Marilyn's eyes, as a necessary, unique part of the pattern. But the emotional crisis was not yet fully past. Marilyn had delivered the philosophy, and now, with the same sharp focus she used for an opening night, she moved instantly to the next critical step, demanding immediate practical action to secure Esther's permanent return to the world. The star who commanded millions on screen now commanded one broken woman on a private phone line. Marilyn Monroe was done with philosophy. She was moving to triage. She laid out a simple, non-negotiable protocol designed not just to save a life, but to re-anchor a fragile soul to the tangible world. "The conversation is over now, Esther, because we have established the truth," Marilyn stated, her voice sharp with necessity. "But the work has just begun. I need you to promise me something, and this is not a request. This is an absolute command." Esther, now flooded with the fragile, overwhelming reality of being pulled back from the brink, simply whispered, "I promise." "First," Marilyn continued, "you must not hang up this phone and be alone. You must call someone right now, a friend, a relative, or someone who can sit with you until the sun rises. Do you have a person you can call?" Esther named a work colleague, a woman she trusted slightly more than others. "Good," Marilyn affirmed. "You call her immediately. If you do not call her, Esther, I will call the police in San Diego and tell them exactly where you live. Do you understand?" The threat was real, gentle, and utterly decisive. It confirmed Marilyn's complete investment in her well-being, but the second step of the protocol was the true anchor. "Second," Marilyn instructed, "I need you to promise me that you will wake up tomorrow. Not the day after, but tomorrow. I need you to call me back." Esther was startled. "This number?" Marilyn chuckled softly, a fleeting private sound. "No, darling, not this one. This number is for emergencies. I'm going to give you a different number now. It is also private, but it is for hope." Marilyn gave Esther a specific, non-sequential 7-digit number and waited patiently while Esther fumbled for a pen, carefully writing down the digits on the same scrap of paper that held the original unlisted line. "You will call me at exactly 4 o'clock in the afternoon Pacific time," Marilyn commanded. "Not 3:55, not 4:05, 4 o'clock. If I do not hear your voice at 4 o'clock, I will assume the worst, and I will be calling San Diego authorities then too. Your only job for the next 12 hours is to stay safe and make that phone call." The establishment of that appointment, a small, concrete anchor thrown into the terrifying future, was more effective than any spiritual platitude. It gave Esther a job, a purpose, and a required destination. It forced her to live for the next day, for the next moment of accountability. With the protocol set, the contact information exchanged, and the promises made, the star delivered her final command of the night. "Now, hang up this phone, Esther, call your friend, and I will see you tomorrow at 4 o'clock. It was a goodbye utterly devoid of Hollywood theatrics, a simple, firm sign-off that carried the weight of a solemn oath. The most important phone call of Esther's life ended with the undeniable, tangible promise of a beginning. The sun rose over San Diego, not as a mocking, indifferent light, but as a promise Marilyn Monroe had insisted Esther wake up to claim. At 3:59 in the afternoon, Esther sat by her telephone, her hand hovering over the private number she still couldn't believe was real. This was the moment the fragile lifeline forged in the dark solidified into a sacred, secret covenant. Esther had managed the day with a focused, almost robotic determination. The task, survive until 4 o'clock, was an immense Herculean labor, but the thought of disappointing the iconic, compassionate voice on the other end was a powerful deterrent. She had called her colleague and survived the initial awkward conversation, but the true relief came precisely when the minute hand swept on to the 12. Esther dialed the new private number. It rang once. Marilyn answered instantly. "Hello, Esther," Marilyn said, her voice warm and clear, the huskiness of the night before gone. There was a faint sound of classical music in the background. "I knew you would call. I never doubted you." That simple statement, "I never doubted you," was a tonic. It was the first time in Esther's life someone had expressed complete, unwavering faith in her capacity to endure. The conversation moved quickly past the crisis. Marilyn, in her role as quiet mentor, asked pointed questions. "What did you do today that was just for Esther? What small piece of beauty did you see?" The calls became a weekly ritual, always on Tuesday afternoons at 4 o'clock. This was Marilyn's sanctuary time, and she dedicated it fully to fostering the small, flickering light she had helped reignite. The bond deepened into a rare, secret friendship based on equality and raw honesty. They spoke of books, of dreams, and of the exhausting effort required to put on a brave face for the world. Esther, encouraged by Marilyn's fierce intellectual curiosity, confessed her long-abandoned love for sketching and painting. Marilyn, who had once dreamed of a more serious acting career, was ruthless in her encouragement. "You must use your light, darling," she insisted. "The world has enough people who can fill a form and answer a phone. It needs people who can show it the color it has forgotten." Marilyn challenged Esther to enroll in a night class, to buy a canvas, and to create the small, unique beauty Esther had convinced herself the world didn't need. For 4 years, the weekly conversations continued. It was a secret mentorship that bypassed public scrutiny and the endless demands of Hollywood. Esther learned about Norma Jean's quiet struggle for dignity. Marilyn learned about Esther's slow, deliberate climb out of the shadow. They were two women, one a blinding star, the other a complete unknown, tethered by a shared vulnerability and an unshakable mutual respect. Esther's life began to take shape, guided by the remote, persistent strength of her unlikely savior. The relationship was a powerful anomaly, a silent act of grace that profoundly changed the course of one invisible woman's future. Esther slowly, methodically, began to weave herself back into the fabric of life, her newfound purpose sustained by the Tuesday afternoon promise. This silent, life-affirming covenant was a kindness the tabloids would never report, and a testament to a legacy far richer than any film reel. The years turned, as they always do, and the world largely forgot the woman Esther Marsh once was. 20 years after that impossible phone call, the woman who had sought to cease existing was now a strong, confident source of light for others, a beautiful, unseen triumph of humanity. Her success was a secret monument to the grace of Marilyn Monroe. Following Marilyn's persistent encouragement, Esther had left her filing cabinet job and enrolled in night classes. She discovered a deep capacity not just for painting, but for helping others unlock their own hidden colors. She became an art therapist. Her quiet, empathetic office a world away from the cold, rain-soaked apartment where she had almost given up the fight. Esther specialized in helping people who felt invisible, using her own raw, shared experience to bring them back into the light. She was no longer a supporting player. She was the curtain raiser, the guiding force, ensuring no one on her watch ever felt that terrifying, crushing finality of utter anonymity. Esther's transformation was profound, visible only to those who knew her now. She carried the lightness and dignity of someone who knew her worth was not assigned by the world, but confirmed by a star she had once idolized. The friendship continued its quiet weekly rhythm for 4 years, a constant, reliable anchor that never slipped. Then came Tuesday afternoon when Esther called at exactly 4 o'clock, and the private line simply rang unanswered. She called again at 4:05 and then 4:15. Only silence. The next day, the headlines screamed the truth across every newspaper in the country. The world mourned the glamorous star, Marilyn Monroe. Esther's grief was deep, profound, and profoundly private. The world grieved the loss of an icon. Esther grieved the loss of her secret anchor, her dedicated mentor, her unexpected friend. She knew she could not share her pain with anyone. The story was too outlandish, too intimate, and too unbelievable. But she carried a fierce, proud certainty. The most important thing Marilyn Monroe ever accomplished was a private act of grace that saved one anonymous woman's life and gave her a purpose. Every successful session Esther conducted, every life she nudged back into the light, was a quiet payment on a debt she could never truly repay, a legacy known only to her. She lives every day for 2 women, for Esther, the woman who learned to paint and to help, and for the courageous, lonely woman named Norma Jean, who, in her own dark night, insisted on being a lighthouse for someone else. Though the star had ceased to live and the voice was gone, Esther carried a profound certainty. The legacy of the most famous woman in the world was not in her films or her fame, but in the single anonymous life she quietly saved. Yet, Esther possesses one small, tangible reminder. A sacred, private object that confirms their secret was absolutely, powerfully real. Esther carries no public photographs or movie posters of the woman who saved her. Her most sacred piece of memorabilia is kept locked in a small, simple wooden box. opened only once a year on the anniversary of the night she called in the darkness. It is the final, tangible proof of an impossible act of grace. Today, as the rain falls gently, Esther sits in her bright, art-filled office, lifting the lid of the small, simple pine box. Inside, resting on a bed of faded lavender sachet, are 2 scraps of paper. One is the original worn piece of paper with 3 different phone numbers scribbled on it, the unlisted emergency line, the hope line, and her friend's number, a map of her personal journey back from the edge. The other item is a small, heavy piece of creamy stationery, smelling faintly of expensive, long-gone perfume. It is not a formal letter, but a short, deliberate note written in Marilyn Monroe's famous, elegant, looping script. Esther picks it up, her fingers tracing the ink that has held its color for 20 years. It is signed with a simple, deliberate M. The entire note contains only one sentence, the one single, life-altering truth that changed everything. The light you carry is the only light that matters to those who haven't found theirs yet. Esther smiles through the tears that finally break free. She knows Marilyn wrote this note for her during one of their later calls, likely during a moment when Esther doubted her own continued purpose. Marilyn had insisted on sending it, saying, "You need to see it, darling, not just hear it. You need proof when the shadows try to lie to you again." It was the ultimate gesture of empathy. The star, burdened by her own chaos, thinking ahead to shore up the future of a complete stranger. Esther realizes that the greatest, most profound tragedy of Marilyn's eventual passing was that the world never fully understood the immense, ferocious capacity for human kindness that lay beneath the glittering surface. The world focused on the star's fragility, but it missed her fundamental protective strength. Marilyn, who desperately needed to be saved herself, always retained the pure instinct of a rescuer. She was the one drowning who still managed to toss a powerful rope to someone else. The story of Marilyn Monroe is often framed by tragedy, glamour, and despair. But Esther's secret, the single, quiet, anonymous act of sitting on a phone line at 3 o'clock in the morning and insisting on the value of a broken woman's soul, tells the truest, most human story of all. We live in a world obsessed with fame and spectacle, judging success by the size of the crowd that gathers. But Esther's triumph reminds us that sometimes the greatest acts of heroism happen quietly, in the profound intimacy of the shared darkness. The greatest legacy one person can leave behind is not how many people knew their name, but how profoundly they affirm the necessary light of another. Marilyn Monroe didn't just save Esther's life, she commanded her to live a life worthy of the second chance. Esther carefully folds the sacred note and places it back in the box, closing the lid on her secret, beautiful proof. She rises from her chair, turns on the light in her art studio, and prepares to welcome her first client of the day, a client who, like Esther once, feels lost and unseen. Esther sits down, ready to share the quiet, profound lesson she learned from the most luminous star in the world. Your light is necessary. This story is the true measure of her legacy. The greatest legacy one person can leave behind is not how many people knew their name, but how profoundly they affirm the necessary light of another.